your events could deliver twice the value for the same money. Well, maybe not your events, I don't want to offend you, but I believe that meetings and events in general have a large untapped potential for delivering more value. To achieve this, we need first of all to have a set of relevant, detailed and measurable objectives. Then we have to design the format and content of the event to meet those specific objectives, and then we measure the results to prove the value to management. The ROI methodology is the foundation for creating profitable events. And I shall now give you a brief insight into how we set objectives and measure results. Let me start by telling you a story. This didn't happen to me, it happened to a colleague, Mike, who is also an ROI consultant. He had a phone call one day from someone who said, I work for a cleaning franchise company. We have franchisees up and down the country, they clean schools and hospitals and offices and so on. We provide the global branding and they buy their cleaning equipment and supplies from us. That's the franchise model. Once every year we have a big franchise meeting. It's 1,000 people, mostly the general managers of these cleaning contractors. We get together for 3 days, which means that most of them have to travel one day to get there and another day to get home, so we take them out of business for nearly a week. The event itself is all smoke and fireworks and big stage sets, and we pay for that. And I can tell you it's costing a fortune. We've started to discuss recently in the management team, is it really worth the money? How do we get the money back? Is it worth all the time that we ask of these cleaning contractor managers to spend nearly a week out of the office? Maybe we should do something else with that money. Could you measure the return on investment for our meeting? Well, that's the kind of question that people like Mike and I love to get on the phone. So Mike said, yes, of course, that's what I do for a living. I'd be happy to do that. Well, that's great, said the other chap. And you know, the timing is perfect because this year's meeting is only 2 weeks from now. So we can explain what is the program and then you do your questionnaires or whatever it is you do to measure the ROI. So the deal was done. Mike came along just a few days later for a briefing with a group of managers, and he started the meeting by asking them just a simple, straightforward question. He said, what exactly do you know that participants should do differently after the event in order to make more money? Now, that was just a common sense question, wouldn't you agree? He simply assumed that was the purpose of the meeting. And they understood the point, and the exercise started, and they were suggesting a lot of things like they need to learn how to use social media in their marketing, or they need to learn how to negotiate long-term contracts so they don't need to pitch for work all the time, or they need to learn how to use more modern equipment for cleaning windows in tall buildings and so on. And there was really no shortage of ideas. But whenever they suggested something, Mike had a follow-up question. He said, but why don't they do that already? I mean, if you know if they did that, they would make more money, why don't they do it already? What's stopping them? Or put differently, how can you be sure that after the event they will go home and do exactly that? So the follow-up question was not quite as easy to answer as the first one. And as they were coming up to lunchtime, the room was just filled with frustration. And one of them stood up and he said, you know what? This meeting we have planned less than 2 weeks out. It's a totally different event. It will not achieve those things that you have now made us tell you it needs to achieve for everybody to have a positive ROI. Now, I think we can all imagine this situation. You're less than 3 weeks out. You have 1,000 senior executives for 3 weeks, all smoking fireworks. It's not the time when you want to start changing things. Well, they changed everything. First thing they did was to go through the list of speakers. And they just asked, what will he or she speak about? What will they learn from that? And what will that make them do? And if the final answer was not on one of the flip charts, which were now covering the walls of the meeting room, then why was the speaker in the program? And through this exercise, they decided to cancel more than half the speakers. I don't know what they told them. It must have been words to the effect that, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we've just realised we have no idea why we put you in our program. And they went back to the venue, and luckily they could get a lot more space, because now they needed breakout rooms for social media marketing workshop and contract negotiations workshop, and they needed exhibition space for window cleaning equipment. And it became a totally different event, and only because of Mike's very simple common sense question: what exactly do you know that these people should do differently after the event in order to make more money? Now, this story illustrates quite well what we call the principle of value creation. There is one principle which applies to all kinds of meetings and events, and it's the only way in which any meeting or event can create value. To create value, you have to influence the participants. Now, if you don't like the word influence, you can say you have to educate them or inspire them or empower them, but somehow you have to have an influence on their mind. That's why you've got them in the room in the first place. And you have to influence them to physically do something. Not just to feel or think something, they have to physically do something, something which is so physical that if you were in their office when they did it, you could see or hear them do it. And they have to do something which adds value to the stakeholders. And our task as meeting planners is to achieve this particular behaviour at the lowest possible cost. That's what event design or meeting planning is all about, and nothing else. There are two important words in this statement. The first one is the to-do. It has to be physically, not just feeling and thinking. The other is the word stakeholder. All meetings and events have a number of stakeholders. Usually there is a meeting owner, so it doesn't necessarily become a big problem. But we have to be clear that different stakeholders probably look for different behaviours to get value back. So if you have, say, 5 different major stakeholders for your meeting, you may have to collect 5 different sets of data, and you would measure 5 different ROIs from the same meeting. Sometimes people ask me, Ellen, can you measure the results or measure the return on investment for this meeting? And I say, no, I can't. Nobody can. Meetings as such don't have value. You have to tell me first on behalf of which stakeholder do you want to measure results. And that's why the stakeholder is so important. Now, let's get back to this conversation between Mike and the other chaps. Remember, he was saying, we're wondering how do we get our money back. It's as if he had an implied ROI objective. He didn't mind if they didn't make any money, but he didn't like the idea of the event losing them money. So he had a sort of break-even or 0% ROI objective for the event. Not very ambitious, but often it's a good place to start. In order to measure the ROI, we first need to know what profit did the event make. Now, the formula for profit is simple. On the one hand, you create value. On the other hand, you have some costs. And then profit is the value created by the event minus the cost. And once you have the profit, you have the ROI. They're essentially the same thing. ROI is simply that profit as a percentage of the cost of the event. So we need to figure out the value, and we call those objectives for value, impact objectives. Sometimes we call them business impacts. Think of what impact does the event have on the bottom line of the company, if we talk about a corporate event. If the event is not for money, if it's a not-for-profit organisation, say you're the Cancer Society, then to talk about making bottom line profit doesn't really make sense. Then we have to look at what's the equivalent of profit and shareholder value in a not-for-profit organisation. And then we need to look at their mission statement. You need to have an impact on their mission. For the Cancer Society, I'm sure it is to reduce suffering from cancer. That would be the impact of your event. The impact is created through behaviour. We've already talked about that. And if you ask a behavioural psychologist, how do you change people's behaviour? He or she will tell you that before you can change behaviour, you need a cognitive change. Something needs to change in the mind, consciously or subconsciously. Now, a cognitive change is just a fancy word for a learning experience. So we set learning objectives. We have different kinds of learning, 4 different types. First one we call information learning. When I say learning, that's probably the first thing you think about, learning new information or knowledge. And it's hard to think of any meeting or event which doesn't have some elements of information learning. Sometimes we learn how to do something. That's a skill. So we can have skills learning objectives. Doctors go to a medical congress to learn a new diagnostic procedure. That'd be a skill. Or your user group conference where your customers learn how to use the new release of your software. That would also be skills learning. But you don't find skills learning at all events. The third type of learning we call attitude learning. Now, my wife is a school teacher in Norway. At her school there are children from 43 different nationalities. In her class of 27 this year, she has 14 different nationalities. And my wife says it's extremely important that the children learn good values and attitudes. So your branding event, when you want customers to think more favourably of you or your product, is an attitude learning experience. Your staff event, when you want your staff to love their managers even more, is an attitude learning event. The fourth type of learning we call relationship learning. It's what the Germans call kennenlernen. Why do salespeople want customer hospitality event? To build trust and liking. That's relationship learning. So we have these 4 different types of learning. We learn information, skills, attitudes, and relationships. For learning to be effective, we need a good learning environment. So we set objectives for the learning environment. I don't know about you, I've been to events where networking is important and the music is so loud you can't talk to people. Well, that's a simple example of not a very good learning environment for the purpose. We usually measure the learning environment by measuring the satisfaction of participants on 2 dimensions. First, if they're satisfied with the hospitality, the food and the venue and so forth, they were well received, they were seen, they were made feel comfortable. And on the other dimension, we want them also to be satisfied with the content. I came here to network with customers. Well, did they have opportunity to network with customers? Or I came here to learn the ROI methodology. Well, did I learn the ROI methodology? That's satisfaction with content. And if participants are satisfied with hospitality and content, you probably had a good learning environment. But there are many other things that go into the learning environment, and we don't necessarily ask the participants to evaluate them for us. Some of the most important things include the quality of your speakers and the design of your learning sessions and so forth. Last but not the least, we have what we call target audience objectives. If you don't have the right people in the room, then you can forget about the rest. Target audience is often underestimated in terms of its importance. So these are different types of objectives that we need to set for all events. And we put them into what we call the ROI pyramid, where the lowest level, the foundation of our pyramid, we call it level 0, is the target audience objectives. Then we have the learning environment. We've got the right people in the room. Now you've got to give them a good learning environment so that we can measure that learning. Remember the 4 types of learning: information, skills, attitudes, relationships, they take place. And as a result of that learning experience, we're driving specific behaviors that we need to create an impact. And when we know the impact and the cost of the meeting, we can calculate the return on investment. And this, what you're looking at now, is essentially the main principles of the ROI methodology. When we plan the event, we pretty much start from the top of the pyramid and we set objectives. We need to know what behavior we're going to drive before we can decide on what learning experience is necessary. We need to know why they don't do that already, remember Mike, before we can design the learning experience that will make them do it. And when we know what learning experience to take them through, we need to design the learning environment which will make that happen. When we measure the results, we start from the bottom. Did we have the right people in the room? Did we give them a good learning environment? Did we measure learning, which drove the behavior that we needed to give us the impact and the ROI? That's the ROI methodology. When we move from level 3 behavior to level 4, which is impact, there's a couple of complications that sometimes kick in. The first one we call the isolation issue. Say you have a customer event to drive sales, and sales go up after the event, but you were running an advertising campaign at the same time. So when sales went up, was it because of the event or because of the advertising? That's what we call the isolation issue, isolating the effects of the meeting from other influences. And we can always do that. The best method is always to use a control group experiment like they do in pharma. They give the new medicine to one group of patients and the placebo to another group, and then they check who gets well quicker. Well, we can do the same thing for meetings and events. We compare the behavior of a group that attend the event and a carefully chosen control group that didn't attend. But that can be complicated, can be a big project sometimes, and also inconvenient. We won't invite all our customers to the meeting. We don't want to leave some out because they're going to be the control group. So in practice we use other quicker, much easier methods of estimation. And most of the time we can get good credible data to isolate the effect of the meeting from other influences. Then sometimes we have what we call the conversion problem. If you're driving sales, then you're okay because sales is already a money value. But if you're doing say a management training event, if you're going to calculate the financial return on investment on that, you first have to convert better management into money. And we can do that as well. It's not as difficult as it may sound, and you'd be surprised to find how many people have addressed this issue over many years. There are many standard values. You can read many books of case studies on how non-monetary value has been converted for various purposes into money in a business sense. So this is the ROI methodology. It's not something that I've come up with. It's been developed over more than 30 years, mostly by a chap in America called Jack Phillips. There are more than 30,000 practitioners trained and trainers like myself around the world in more than 20 disciplines. Meetings and events is just one of them, and that came up about 10 years ago. There are trainers and consultants in more than 50 countries, and if you want to read a book, there are more than 60 books to read. And looking at some of the more recent books, it gives you some idea where this methodology is being applied. You have ROI in technology development, for example, ROI in healthcare, ROI in training and development, in mergers and acquisitions. You have ROI, or the ROI methodology applies in any walk in life where results are created by changing the behavior of people, which is what we want to do with our meetings and events. So with these simple principles that I have explained and these credentials, I think that the ROI methodology should be your standard operating procedure for setting objectives and measuring the results for all your meetings and events. Thank you very much.